If I haven't had the good opportunity to meet you, my name is Kate Alexander. I'm Associate Director of Florida Studio Theater and Director of the Forums Project and of dancing lessons across the street. And I'd like to welcome you to our second panel discussion on Sarasota today. If you would take a moment to turn your cell phones in the off position, we'd appreciate it. This panel will run about an hour and 15 minutes. We will bring our panelists up shortly, and the last part of the panel will be questions with the audience, so we build a dialogue from there. Before we begin, I do want to recognize our two actors from Fly who are with us today. If you'd stand, Sean and Mike. Done an extraordinary job in the show, which is absolutely selling out and having a huge impact on our community and culture. And I'd like to thank Charles Clapsaddle here with METV, who's the director and who has been instrumental in all of these forums, thank you, Charles. And they will be connected both to METV and ABC7. I'd like to now turn it over to the chair of the forums, Judge Charles Williams, who was just recently elected as Chief Justice of the 12th District Court, has been instrumental, absolutely. An absolute favorite person in our community, a leading judge, instrumental in these forums, both in thought, content on the online forum, which we hope you write for as well, read, weigh in on it, and also the scope of the forums and the content. Judge Williams is also an independent filmmaker and has some films coming up at the Sarasota Film Festival. So, Judge, I'd like to turn it over to you and thank you for moderating this discussion.
And one correction, I'm co-chair with you. I'm not chair, I'm co-chair.
Thank you, Judge.
I want to thank everybody for coming, first of all, and at this time we're going to get started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the panelists to come forward, and as they come forward as a group, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. So if our panelists would come up, first Captain Patrick Robinson, and then Dr. Eddie Renier, the Honorable Larry Eager.
And you can come up on
stage. And just come right up on stage.
Thank you.
And Trevor Harvey.
I think right there.
And our mayor, Willie Shaw. I'll give you a brief bio of each. Captain Patrick Robinson has been a police officer with the Sarasota Police Department since 2000. Currently, he is assigned as the commander of the Patrol Division, which encompasses all of the patrol and specialized units in the police department, as well as the crime prevention and volunteer programs. Dr. Eddie Renier is an associate professor of the Sarasota School of Professional Psychology and Behavioral Sciences for Argosy University, Sarasota. Dr. Renier has clinical privileges at Sarasota Memorial Hospital and is involved in the community on various boards and has served on various panel discussions that we've had here at Florida Studio Theater. The Honorable Larry Eager served as an attorney in the Public Defender's Office for 24 years, some of it as an underling to me, by the way.
My first mentor.
But he got bigger and better, and he was recently, well, not recently, but elected as public defender for the 12th Judicial Circuit. Mr. Eager is head of the Manatee County Division of the Public Defender's Office. Actually, you're the head of the whole office, so that was an error. Unless you got demoted.
That's an old bio.
Okay, that's an old bio. Immediately to my right is Mayor Willie Charles Shaw, who graduated from Berean Bible College and Seminary. He's also a graduate of Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. He is a military veteran, and he served on the Sarasota City Commission for over 3 years. Trevor Harvey, sitting to Kate's immediate left, Currently serves as the president of the Sarasota County branch of the NAACP, a title he has held since 2005. He was appointed the area director of the Florida State Conference of the NAACP in 2007. So let's have a round of applause for our panelists. What I would like to do to kick off our discussion is to read to you a quote by our current FBI director, James B. Coney. And this is from a letter, an open letter that he wrote on February 12th of this year. It begins this way. With the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, the death of Eric Garner in Staten Island, the ongoing protests throughout the country, and the assassination of NYPD officers Wenjin Liu and Rafael Ramos, we are at a crossroads. As a society, we can choose to live our everyday lives, raising our families and going to work, hoping that someone, somewhere, will do something to ease the tension and to smooth over the conflict. We can roll up our car windows, turn up the radio, and drive around these problems. Or we can choose to have an open and honest discussion about what our relationships are today, what it should be, what it could be, and what it needs to be, if we took more time to better understand each other. One commentator, when talking about national conversations on race, says these conversations go nowhere because of one major reason. Whites and racial minorities speak a different language when they talk about racism, and this is supported by many scholars and psychologists. So with that being a starting point for our conversation, I would ask if any panelists would like to respond to those quotes or comments. And I think I'm going to pick on Dr. Renier.
Thank you.
And if everyone would hold the mic about a couple inches away from their mouth, thanks.
I have had the honor, it's not a privilege, because I don't think I wanted this, to have lived through segregation, desegregation, integration, first African Americans to enter white universities. Having had that experience, I have a different perspective on things. I think we have changed an awful lot. I think we've come a long, long way. I remember as a boy not being able to walk on the same sidewalk with a white person. I remember being afraid to look at a white female and that bad things happened. This was in Boston, Massachusetts, the Athens of America, where the most educated people lived, where the brightest minds were. And today, those things are gone. So I think we've made a lot of change. Having said that doesn't mean that we don't have more changes to make. We have a lot of changes to make. But I see those changes everywhere happening. In Sarasota, when I travel all over the country, I see changes happening. So I am really hopeful. I am feeling the best about racial relations than ever in my history.
What I'd like to do is talk specifically about Sarasota, and I'm going to ask Trevor Harvey and Mayor Shaw really to comment on some of the things that are a constant theme that I have heard during my time living here in Sarasota. And these are the comments that we hear constantly. One, the lack of African American presence in downtown Sarasota at cultural events and social events. We can sort of look at this audience as an example of that. Many questions that I get are, where are the African Americans, and do they feel welcome in Sarasota? Because we don't see them, and I'm speaking in terms of the white majority. So let's start right with those perceptions about Sarasota. And I don't know if Mr. Harvey or Mayor Shaw, if you want to comment. Is that a reality? Is that a perception? Is that something that you have heard? And what are your feelings about that?
Judge Williams, it's probably all of the above. It's reality, it's a perception. A lot of it is probably real. I think growing up, for me anyway, as a young lad in the Sarasota community who was born and raised here, oftentimes we were not welcome on the invisible side of the line growing up. So I think from a cultural standpoint, because that was embedded in us, that we didn't go on that side of town, it's still from a history standpoint or a psychological standpoint, many feel that they can't go across that invisible line. Because let's face it, we do have an invisible line, and it's probably more prevalent now than it was probably 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I think a lot of what you're hearing is in that fact. A lot of it is perception. A lot of it is reality. I mean, there are some of us who feel, we can go wherever we want to go, and we will go wherever we want to go. But the mass majority feels that they're still not welcome across that invisible line.
And I'm going to direct this to Mayor Shaw, because really it's kind of unusual for me to ask an African-American mayor, where are all the African Americans in downtown Sarasota? But if anybody would have an insight into that, it would be you. So I'm going to ask you to comment on that. And again, is that a perception? Is it a reality? Is it just an illusion?
No, it is a reality. It's not a perception. For the many people that we do find downtown that are of color, you will find them either being retirees to this area or persons coming to this area that have enjoyed the arts and culture in other areas, for the big part. Locally, we don't interact for many reasons. One, exposure. We don't expose ourselves to downtown Sarasota, many of the cultural events, for an ignorance, and I use that word not in a derogatory sense, but a lack of understanding of what this city has to offer. When we look around us, how many of you can look at a television ad and see an air conditioner man of color in that ad, or a plumber, or an electrician? So when we don't make our city an inclusive city, then you don't make people feel as though they are welcome to these things. And I use that because if you look around, how many of you see black men or women in white and green cars of the law enforcement in this county? We don't. And I can probably say that on any one day, on one hand, you won't find 5 throughout the system. We have 575 square miles of road to patrol, and so when you don't see me, I am here, but am I welcome where you see me?
And I'd like to address the next series of questions to Captain and to our public defender, because this is another perception. I mean, we couch this conversation in race, but let's talk about another issue. And I recall at a prior panel, Larry Eager once indicating that it was more so about economics than about race. One of the other issues that has given Sarasota sort of a negative light is the homeless and the issues involving the homeless. And I know, Mr. Mayor, you have some policy issues that we can discuss, but I want to talk about people who deal with that issue on a daily basis. So Sarasota has this perception from outsiders that it is hostile towards the homeless, and that there's an issue in terms of what do we do with these people who come to Sarasota, but either because of issues involving addiction or mental health, finances, they have no place to live. So the perception is that Sarasota is hostile to them, and again, is that a proper assessment? Is that a reality? I'll start with Larry, and then I'll ask the captain to also weigh in on that, since both of you deal with those issues.
Well, in addressing the original question, and I think it segues into the second question, as far as my perception of this community, which I've lived here since 1968, and my father came here starting in 1927. This is one of the most segregated communities I've ever been to. And when I say segregation, it's not just race. we segregate ourselves primarily, I think, economically, but you don't see, or there's little to no interaction between old and young, between black, white, Hispanic, whatever. We've created our enclaves, and this is not an integrated community. And as a result, I think we address our problems in a very segmented or segregated fashion. And how we treat the poor, and again, I agree with Judge Williams. My lens is clearly race almost being secondary. It's an issue of poverty and how we treat those who are impoverished. And my office, we represent those who have been deemed poverty-stricken and facing criminal charges and facing a jail sentence. They're all poor. Disproportionately, we represent blacks because blacks in this community disproportionately have a lower economic status in this community. And there's little to no, as I see it, black middle class. How we address our homeless is just, again, symptomatic. We don't want to address it. We don't want to confront the issues. We don't even want to have an honest conversation as far as I'm concerned. And I know that I differ from how, I can be very upfront, and the proposals that were made and the work that was done over the past couple of years went nowhere. And I think for those very reasons. We don't want to fix the problem, we want to complain about it. And the solutions that people come up with, the result is not on my dime, not in my backyard. I don't want, I recognize the problem, how can we push it out elsewhere? Which again is symptomatic, I think, of the segregation that we perpetuate. So that's my reality.
And Captain Robinson, your units, your patrols, you deal with this issue as it relates to homeless, and we will circle back to issues involving race and ethnicity, but certainly it's been topical on in the last few months about the homeless problem that we have here in Sarasota. Again, this idea that somehow we are not a welcoming city for those folks. So what's your perspective, and what's law enforcement's perspective on that?
Well, I think, number one, I think it would be a misnomer for me to speak on behalf of all law enforcement. I think I can speak primarily on our department and our interaction within our jurisdiction. And I have to really agree with Larry in a lot of ways. Having grown up in Sarasota and I graduated from Riverview High School, and as the youngest panel member, I think, Trevor might be about the same age as me, right? Probably.
Don't go there.
I just want to say, I think to tie in the actual play itself, and I think it goes back to what the doctor was saying, we all have a different perspective on what we bring to the table. And I think one of the key points in the play that really struck home with me was the idea of this flowing consciousness, the stream. And if anyone recalls, you're all in a stream, and where you get in and where you get out is predicated on your lifespan. And what you do within that stream is really what defines your legacy within the story. And to that end, I was not overtly aware of many of the issues that we deal with until I became a police officer, and quite frankly, very uneducated in getting into law enforcement. I'm not from a law enforcement family like the chief has generations. My dad was a pottery teacher, so I didn't have a lot of law enforcement background. I actually primarily got into it from a financial standpoint for a job, because my dad said either get a job or go enlist. But I can tell you that it's an incredibly challenging subject in downtown Sarasota, actually throughout the entire county. Because one of the things, and I handle the vast majority of complaints in relation to citizen calls for service and also complaints from citizenry in reference to the handling or not handling of the homeless situation. And one of the things that I've really found, and it ties into what Larry was saying, is success is defined on an individual basis. What one portion of the conversation believes is success, another thinks is a failure, and what that person thinks is a failure is actually a success for another individual. And it's very hard for law enforcement, because our primary function is to enforce the law is we are being asked to take on a secondary or ancillary social role, which honestly is very complicated due to the fact that we have a lot of statutory obligations that we need to facilitate. And quite frankly, almost every single call for service that we get called to, especially in reference to a transient or homeless situation, results in one of two people being upset. Either the homeless individual that we're having to take some enforcement action, and or if we deem it improper to take action, it's the complainant calling saying, well, you didn't do anything about this problem. The one thing that I think needs to be very clearly articulated in this conversation is a systematic approach is definitely necessary, but a success is deemed by every individual that you can positively impact. And frankly, our successes are in hours, they're in days, they're in saving someone's life at the end of the day. The operational level is if I can help one person one time and help them out that specific incident and keep them safe, that's a great thing for us. Overall, we're working towards, I would hope, a more open and honest conversation with regard to that and how law enforcement can dovetail into the supporting role instead of having to constantly be at the spearhead of that issue. And I think that will happen overall. I'm not sure if Larry and I agree that we are working towards that. I think maybe not as quickly as some would like or slower than others would like, but at least I take this conversation as a positive step in that progression, in that stream.
And I want to thank you because we're now going to go into an area in which I think is one of the reasons that we started this whole series of conversations, especially this year. Ethnic minorities have a very complicated relationship with law enforcement, and that's something that we have to discuss when we talk about not only issues that are happening nationally, but issues that are happening locally. And I say it's a very complex relationship because in lower income neighborhoods, crime is probably the number one stressor of those people who live in those neighborhoods. Black on black crime is the number one cause of death of black males between 18 and 35 is homicide. And so the relationship between law enforcement and the inner city and low-income neighborhoods should be one of support. It should be one of codependence. But I do want to talk about a situation that has occurred, and I think the best way to segue into this is to talk to our head of our NAACP, who issued, or at least has published, a paper that we're going to be able to, I think, share with you at some point, and it's called the 411 on the 5-0. And I'm going to ask Mr. Harvey to explain what that is, why that's important, and also give us a little bit of insight as to this complexity of the relationship with law enforcement from our local angle first, and then maybe nationally. And then I would like Mayor Shaw to comment on that. But we'll start with you, Trevor.
Judge, for the most part, from where I sit at, I believe that we have a fairly decent relationship with local law enforcement on both sides, on the city and the county side. However, that doesn't negate that there is some realities within both departments that seriously have to be addressed. And a few years ago, or probably about maybe 10, 15 years ago, because of all of the police brutality cases that we were seeing locally or even across the country, the NAACP decided to come up with this 411 on the 5-0 curriculum. Shortly after the Rodney Mitchell situation, I organized a community forum town hall meeting at Harvest Tabernacle.
And just for those who don't know about that, could you explain to the audience what the Rodney Mitchell situation was?
I believe it was 2012, I believe the summer of 2012. Rodney Mitchell, young African-American male, driving from Manatee County into Sarasota County, and was perceived to be stopped for a seatbelt violation. In him being stopped by the county, and we want to make it clear, it was the green uniforms, green and white uniforms, that when the young man was stopped, some kind of altercation occurred between the officer and the driver, Mr. Mitchell, of the vehicle. It's really not clear. I don't think, we may not never know exactly what transpired. But in the end, Rodney's life was taken by this officer. The officer basically stated that he felt that Rodney was using the vehicle as a weapon, and his life was threatened. So, you know, he opened fire and ended up killing Rodney. Coming to find out that Rodney was wearing a seatbelt. So we're trying to say in the pitch dark, how could you say that he didn't have a seatbelt on it anyway? So there's a lot of uncertainties, but that's the deal with the Rodney Mitchell situation. So because of that, what I felt that we needed to do as the head of the NAACP here locally is we need to hold law enforcement accountable for their actions any day. I would state that to the day that I die. They're wrong, they need to be held accountable, just like if we don't wear a uniform. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we hold ourselves accountable as well as a community. And we have to make sure that we equip our young individuals, especially our young males. How do you interact with law enforcement when you're in the streets, if you're walking, if you're riding your bike, if you're in your home? And that's what this pamphlet, that we have, and that we have some papers for the audience on the way out, that basically just tells our individuals, if you're approached by the officer, stay calm, ask for badge numbers, those kind of things.
Well, let me give you an example of the information that you give to people. You talk about what happens if you're in your car. Upon request, present your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. If you are suspected of drunk driving and refuse to take a sobriety test, the police may arrest you or seize your driver's license. If you're on the street, you are not required to answer any incriminating questions, but failing to truthfully answer simple ones will make the police suspicious and might be deemed a misdemeanor. If requested, show your identification. You talk about incidents in your home. If the police say they have a warrant, ask to see it before letting them enter your home. You also talk about if you are arrested, immediately state your refusal to speak to the police and make a request for an attorney. Do not make any statements other than giving your name and address. You have the right to remain silent, etc. If you are under 18 years of age, tell the police and ask for your parents to be contacted immediately. So what basically is your rationale for giving this information to people in the community? Basically,
we want, the reason for giving the information is we want our young people to be safe or to come home. I have two, obviously they're black. I have two sons and now helping raise two grandsons. So I'm building that Harvey legacy, and I want that Harvey legacy to stay around for a long time. And at the end of the day, as I tell my own sons, one's in the military and one is still trying to find his way, I don't want them to handle those battles in the street. I want to equip them because I want them to come home in the evening. So my goal is let me equip you so you know how to interact, you know how to respond when you're in the streets. So therefore, if something has occurred that was not correct, then let those of us who have the expertise and the knowledge to deal with that on the front. I remember a couple years ago when we did the Rodney Mitchell situation, our public defender, Larry, graciously told the audience that you're not going to win those battles in the streets.
Okay, so would you say that this is sort of a survival manual?
It's definitely a survival manual.
Okay. Before I speak to Mayor Shaw, Larry, you wanted to make a comment.
I just really want to quickly comment. The tragedy, as I perceive it, that this is the conversation that you have to have with your children if you're black. And this is where, there's vestiges of improvement, and I'm not disregarding that, but this is what I'm seeing on a daily basis. I see a complete breakdown in the rule of law. And when I say the breakdown of the rule of law, we're talking about the trenches here, but I look at it on a broader scheme and how, it's become wealth as opposed to culpability, dictates your access to justice. I have a client standing next to me who stole $100, who's going to jail, yet we have a president who basically overlooks an economic crisis that put this country in, the closest depression that we've had since the 20s. Am I getting that correct? And there's not a single person who went to jail. There's no culpability there because that's dictated by wealth. And that's where I keep bringing it back to, it's an issue of poverty versus wealth.
Well, I'm going to ask Mayor Shaw his comments, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Renier, who serves on a committee that I think the audience will find, a commission actually, that the audience will find interesting and very relevant. But Mayor Shaw, what is your position on what's been said, especially with the information that the NAACP is distributing in the community, and your feelings about that?
I was there when Trevor made it was at Harvest that we did this, and we've gone to several churches in the area to do this. It is survival. We do want our children to come home. We live in an environment where negligence or anything else can create a homicide on the other side, and it's our children. So we agree there. And when we come to our relationships with law enforcement, I spearheaded a traveling trip to New York first with Dr. David Kennedy to address a difference in the style of law enforcement in there. Normally when we hear community policing and there, we normally speak of teams. We had to first change that dynamic and make it a departmental understanding, and to see that working, it's moving in the right direction. We're not there yet, but we're on the way there. I have to agree, and if I went back to say, you don't see white folk from Sarasota on Main Street because of the economics. The average white family from Sarasota isn't on Main Street, so that is a fact. We have to realize it. When we deal with the homeless, and I have to back to that one, we are at a difference in some of our understanding. My position was one that, no, I didn't want it in my backyard. We had 66 areas vested in this, to be vetted in this community, and the only 3 that were truly viable were in District 1. Now here's the district having the highest crime, the highest unemployment, the lowest in economic and total disparity, and we're going to compound this by bringing not just the homeless. The idea was to bring from throughout the county the chronic, big difference, homeless to this area. The conversation has to be broader than just a shelter, because to house them at night and let them loose in the day, they're going to the same places they've been going. So it creates a burden upon my infrastructure in the city of Sarasota, where my officers now must not only be a psychologist and be able to figure out what we're dealing with the homeless, because not only are the homeless that we're dealing with persons with drug and addiction problems, we have mental issues. So we have a much broader conversation that has to go. And before I quit, let me say this. The conversation was that we only have First Step, Harvest, and the Salvation Army, all of which are full presently. if we had a place to bring people and house them during the night, assess them, we would still yet have to send them someplace. And if these places are already full, we don't have the infrastructure to deal with many of the issues we want to cover with one blanket. So.
Well, you know, one of the things hopefully we will be able to talk a little bit about are alternatives to, because this is a burden that not only law enforcement has to deal with, but the courts have to deal with, the public defender has to deal with, law enforcement has to deal with, and we will circle back to that. But I want to follow up again on the issue of African American youth and crime. The statistics that for years, there are two statistics dealing with African American youth that I always found astounding, and I would always fact check to make certain they were true, is the 1 in 3. You know, 1 in 3 African American males between 18 and 25 are either on probation, parole, or in jail. That's just an amazing, mind-boggling. It may have risen.
No, but I'm saying it's between 18 and 30.
18 and 30.
1 in 3.
Right.
Parole,
probation,
state prison, county jail, or federal prison.
Right.
1 in 3.
And there was a study that was done that many states determined the amount of prison beds that they are going to need. They project based on 4th and 5th grade educational statistics in terms of kids who are left behind. So the percentage of kids that are left behind between, I think, either 4th and 5th or 5th and 6th, they project 10 years ahead and say that those kids more than likely will be incarcerated. So we need to have beds to take care of that.
Judge, can I add in on that?
Yes.
Just really quickly. I think when we say crime or that they're criminals, I think we have to be very careful.
Right.
Because most of those, a huge percentage, are minor crimes.
That's true.
And going back to the wealth issue, that a wealthy middle-class child arrested for marijuana would not be in prison, would get off. And the trauma that that action does to that child and the family forever is so deep and so comprehensive. So I just think sometimes it's easy to make an assumption, oh, they're criminals between 8 and 30. They're not. Most of these crimes are very, very minor, including if we legalize marijuana, we have to also face that we have done damage to millions of families. So I think we have to be very careful because it comes back to wealth and what kind of crime before we say they're criminals.
Well, this issue has been so important to the state of Florida that the governor set up a special task force to study this, and we are fortunate not only to have Dr. Rie here as a panelist in his day-to-day job as a psychologist, but he is also chair of that committee. And if you could briefly talk a little bit about that committee and what your studies have found about what we're talking about today.
Thank you, Judge. It's hard to sit in the seat when I know all the data, and I've been chomping at the bits to speak. 2 years ago, I was appointed to the Florida Council on the Social Status of Black Men and Boys. The council was, the idea of the council was created by Frederica Wilson, Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, who thought that a committee should be established to study disparate conditions that affect black men and boys. And she thought that this council should be made up of all the branches of government. And so we have representations from all the secretaries of the state, governor's office, attorney general, and the House of Representatives in the Florida Senate. We have 2 senators, two representatives, and we are housed in the Attorney General Bondi's building. And so she provides supportive staff for us. What we're entrusted to do is study, in fact, crime rates, health issues, educational problems, economic issues. And we have been doing this for the last 2 years. We've amassed an enormous amount of information. For example, the idea that homicide is the number one leading cause of death of black men and boys, young men, is not true. You know what the leading cause of death is? Strokes, heart attacks, health issues, high blood pressure. That is killing black men like there's no tomorrow, like fire across a weed field. Prostate cancer. You know why that happens to them? They don't go to hospitals. They don't go to doctors. They don't have health care. They're afraid to cross the color barrier to get to the hospital to get a simple blood check or a health care check. And that is the silent killer. Doesn't make the news, but black men, that's the real number one killer. Clearly, homicide is a close second, but the first one is health. Homeless. Boy, I feel bad for law enforcement. Imagine being called by someone who says, someone is trespassing on my property, and that law enforcement officer has no idea what he's going to run into. Person's having auditory hallucinations. Think that God's told them to possess that house. They're angry. They're on drugs too. And that law enforcement guy says, get off of this property. The person who owns that property is feeling horrible. That person wants to move in and live on their doorsteps. That law enforcement says move, and then a fight ensues. And next thing you know, he's into a fight for his life with someone who doesn't feel pain, who is completely irrational and crazy. And you got to take him to a county jail, and that person is completely unable to take care of themselves, completely psychotic. There's nowhere to go. Now this I hold us responsible for. We have no mental health services in the state of Florida. The state of Florida ranks last of the 50 states in mental health. The only two areas worse than Florida is Guam and Puerto Rico. And our governor can't spell mental health. They appointed someone to be head of mental health in the state, a fellow by the name of Bill Harding. He's a lawyer. He can't spell mental health. He said, we don't have a mental health problem. There's plenty of places for people to get mental health care. He says that to the Department of Corrections, and they say, oh, no, sir, that's not true. We spend a good deal of our budget for medication for people to medicate them. I could go on that. That's a deaf ear. The state should be making a resounding scream at Tallahassee for mental health services and mental health dollars. No one seems to care. It's not just the homeless. People my age with dementia. A policeman's called because they're walking around without any clothes on, or they're urinating on the steps. He has no idea what he's meeting. They meet someone who has dementia. Next thing you know, a fight starts, and you got some 78, 84, 87-year-old guy in the county jail who's decorated military, and he can't tell you his name. No place to put that person either. There's no mental health. None at all. I could go on, and on this committee, we've been studying these. We have all the data. No one wants to listen to the data.
I'd like, and by the way, everyone on this panel, I do not endorse any statement. Everybody's an independent on this panel.
And the mayor has to leave.
The mayor does have to leave for a previous engagement. I would like to talk to Captain Robinson about what he has heard. Again, we talk about it clinically, we talk about it legally, but actually it is you and your fellow officers who actually have to deal with it. So what are your thoughts on what we've discussed?
Well, is that close enough? Yes. First and foremost, I'm glad I don't have to debate the doc on the statistics. I'd like to go back to the original conversation or the original topic that Trevor brought up, the idea of knowledge to ensure safety. And I think we all sit here, and it's not just knowledge of the public, it's not just knowledge of the children, but it's also training the officers. Because to stick your head in the sand and believe that we don't have issues that are going on, one is doomed to fail by virtue of not learning from the mistakes of the generations that came before. And I think we're seeing some of those breakdowns in major cities across the US and abroad at this point, actually. And I think one of the things, and Trevor sort of alluded to it 10 years ago, Trevor was a part of the original focus group that brought law enforcement and the pastoral alliances together to address some of these siloed up and bottled up feelings that were breaking down between law enforcement and the community itself. And I can honestly say that I have seen firsthand the absolutely impressive work that those groups have done together, and we continue to do. This is going to be a continuation for years to come. Now, I would like to touch on the idea of the pamphlet and the 411. The fact of the matter is, knowledge is power. And it goes back to what Larry was saying. We have a disparate amount of, I wouldn't even say just minority children that are not being taught, but it's a problem nationwide, regardless of color, regardless of ethnic background, regardless of religion. We're not teaching our children the right way at a young age to be able to succeed on the international stage as we move forward. Speaking about the information that's contained within Trevor's handout, I can speak on behalf of the Chief of Police in the city of Sarasota that getting that information out is paramount to a healthy and mutually beneficial engagement between law enforcement and those in our community. We want people to know their rights, and we want to ensure that we're providing safety not only for the wealthy, but for those that can't afford a great lawyer, one of these folks that are on TV. The challenge is the constant evolution of our laws, the constant evolution of the status of our society as a whole, and what's normative, what's appropriate behavior, what's not appropriate behavior. And as I said, and I'll go back to my original statement, in that stream of consciousness, we always have to alter our course to ensure that we're not hitting things that are put in front of us. And there are opportunities, let's say Ferguson, the situation that unfolded in Ferguson. It's very easy to segment yourself out of that conversation, say, no, we had nothing to do with that, it didn't happen in Sarasota. But one of the fantastic things about this community is we have folks like Trevor, like Larry, that will engage in a conversation, and quite frankly, I'm proud to be part of the command staff of our agency, and I think that we do try, we endeavor to persevere within this conversation. Do we always come up 100%? No, but if you strive for perfection, you will reach excellence. And I really do believe that our community, the city of Sarasota, the county of Sarasota, does a very good job in hashing out some of these issues, much better than a lot of other places, and I guess that's really the measurement. But it's because of the hard work of the folks that are sitting on this panel. I exclude myself from that because I just shuffle paperwork these days. That conversation continues, and it must continue, because if we don't continue to be engaged in the education, then we're going to fall behind. And when you fall behind in those conversations, that's when you see scenarios unfold that create massive explosions of that bottled up tension. So I really do think this educational program, phenomenal. Anything that we can put out to teach people what their rights are, phenomenal. I don't think any police officer that's worth his badge would not say that education, both behind the badge and in front of the badge, leads to a better environment for the officers and the citizenry to work in.
I think you brought up a very good thing, and that is you brought up the underlying tensions in Ferguson. Saw them in New York, Brooklyn, coming up all over country, these little water spouts that could lead to something drastic. I'd like each of you to take a moment. I'd like you to give, from your perspective, and judges, you as well, take your pulse on our city with those underlying tensions. I think, Captain, you just answered that. But if the rest of you would say, where do you think our city is? What is it? Is it capable of that? Where are we on that kind of scale?
I'm going to start on your left.
Trevor?
Wow, that's a good question. I've had this conversation with the chief and others in law enforcement, and I would hope where we are as a community, that what we saw in Ferguson, what we saw in New York, and what we saw in some of the other places around our country, that would not happen in Sarasota. But we don't know until we are actually put into, that situation. I think one of the differences that I see of our community versus of like a Ferguson is that we're not a incompetent politically community, which what I call Ferguson. And people say, why do you call them incompetent politically? When you have a community that has the percentage of African Americans in that community, I believe it's over 90%, or 75%, something of that nature. but almost 95, 96% of the political process or the powers that be don't look like them. To me, that's an incompetent community politically. Because if that community was strong politically, I think what we saw in Ferguson probably would have not happened, because you would have had constant ongoing dialogue and relationships between the communities. And that's what we didn't see that in Ferguson. And that's different for us. We're at the table, we're always having discussions. We're not always right. We do fall short. But I think at the end of the day, we're able to resolve our issues for the most part and move forward.
Thank you. Dr. Renier?
Thank you, Kate. I'm a psychologist in this town. I've been here since 1993. And I specialize in treating young men, particularly young men who are angry. And so I think I have a sense of the pulse of the communities, and I treat a lot of young men. First, let me say I don't think we're at all near what Ferguson's is. There isn't that much anger in this town. Does that mean that there isn't disparity, that there isn't diversity? I think there is. Unlike the other members of the panel, I don't find anything wrong with segregation. Ironically, I think people should live with whoever they want, wherever they want, however they want. No one should tell you that your neighbor should be black or Jew or white. I think that's okay. What I think the issue is, no matter where we live, is really an issue of kindness. How do we treat each other when we leave home? And everywhere in Sarasota, it should be safe. Newtown should not be unsafe, nor should Main Street be unsafe. And we should understand that every one of us is a member of the city, and we should extend that generosity and kindness to each other. Now, I can't legislate behavior, but I can ask you to remember that all of us are members of the city. Being poor is not a problem. God must love poor people because he made so many of them. They're like grains of sand on the beach. So many of them. He loved them, he replicated them again and again, so there's nothing wrong with poverty. I grew up poor than a church mouse. But I always had pride. I always knew I was going somewhere, and I had a mother that told me where we're going. And the young men and women that I talk to in my office who have problems are not bad people. So I don't think we're even near what happened in Ferguson. I'm not saying we don't have a law enforcement problem, because I've come across law enforcement, and I'm gentle, I'm kind, and I've been discriminated against by law enforcement. I was luckily intelligent enough not to escalate it to the next level. I permitted the injustice. Unlike what Judge Williams said, I didn't have the presence of mind because I was so upset to ask for a badge number of your name. I was lucky to get out of the encounter alive. And I don't think there's any black male alive who can't tell you that this has happened to them. And interestingly, this has happened to me when I've had a white passenger in my car. And the white passenger said, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Had you been in my shoes, you've been happy to just keep your mouth shut and escape the encounter so you can return home. Having said that, I've also met wonderful policemen who are my friends. I met both. My issue is kindness. I think we need to extend that to each other. And when we do that, we make this a whole community. When we have preconceived notions about each other, then we're creating division. It's not where we live. It's where we live in our hearts, not in our address.
Thank you. Larry.
You gave me too much time to think about this question. You know, I'm not a man of faith. I have no belief in a higher being, but I do believe in the human spirit, and I do believe in, in spite of what I see on a day-to-day basis, contrary to all evidence, I believe in the inherent good in people. We've had a situation in Sarasota County. We had the Rodney Mitchell incident, which didn't result in rioting. It didn't result in, but every community is different. So I can't account as to why. There was tremendous anger, but it was met with discussion. And I think that talking things through, that's why I'm a true advocate of the truth and reconciliation boards. I think it was successful in South Africa, it was successful in Chile. These are the things, if you can at least have a conversation so that people understand their perspectives and one another, that leads to a greater understanding. That doesn't mean that I don't see abuse on a daily basis. What I see when my clients walk in and how they are treated, how they treat themselves. I had the pleasure of standing next to a 20-year-old, pleading him out to 37 years in prison. And in my conversations with this, I say child, he was 20 years old, but he was done at age 9. There was, his course was set. Do I have an answer to everything? No. Do I think things are getting better? I'd like to think so. Otherwise, it's pretty depressing. And I am depressed, so that certainly goes into it. But that I still keep the fight. When I hear the conversation up here, it gives me great hope and great promise. The fact that you all are here today participating in this conversation, well, actually dialogue since you're just listening, I think there's hope. But I will tell you, I look out and I see it's the usual suspects. I wish that we touched more people. And it's just, as the good doctor says, just be nice. It's so easy, but, well, so I've run out of things to say.
Judge, it's your take.
The only thing, and I do want to sort of tie this into the play, and we have a couple of the actors here from the play. If you haven't seen the play, I encourage you to see it. But, this story is old as the scriptures. I mean, people have been treated badly for thousands of years. People have overcome oppression for thousands of years. The story of America, the story of this country, is the story of people, white, black, Asian, overcoming various forms of oppression and injustice. And so this isn't new. And at the same time, just like you leave the play with a sense of patriotism for these African American airmen who fought battles on two fronts, you don't abandon hope. Those Tuskegee Airmen did not abandon hope, even though they were treated so badly by their own country. They still believed in the promise of America. And so we will have this conversation a generation from now, but I think it's a testament to having those conversations that we still believe in the idea that America works. And bringing it back to Sarasota, we believe that Sarasota works because of these types of conversations. But I think it's important that we always understand our history, always understand that we have to learn from it, and always understand that we have to be comfortable discussing this topic, because we talk all around race. We talk all around religion. We talk all around it, but yet it's there. It's that elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. So regardless of your feelings one way or the other, I think just having the conversation perpetuates the idea that we still do have this hope that this society, this country, this community will get better. And it has. It certainly has, and it will continue to progress. So the people that are here tonight are part of that solution, just being able to have that dialogue and that conversation.
I think we'd like to open up for a few questions. We'd like you to take your thoughts and put them in the form of a question and try to keep it succinct. And comments would be later, so let's take questions first.
I'm not sure if this is a comment and a question. I'm from Canada. I'm a military aviation writer, and I was interested in the Tuskegee Airmen, and obviously this is connected to that. As a journalist, I only ask questions, so I'm not making a pointed statement. I interviewed in Detroit at one of the Tuskegee Airmen, and at the end of my long interview with him, I asked about race relations in the United States today. And of course, he did say things were a lot better, but he gave an example of what he saw as a problem. I wondered if you gentlemen would be interested in responding to that. This gentleman's perception was that if a white teenager was picked up with some marijuana, he would just be charged with possession. If the same teenager happened to be a black young gentleman, he would be charged with trafficking. This is not my opinion. I am just the reporter conveying what was told to me. Is this likely to be true?
I think Mr. Eager should address that question.
No, it's not true. But I will make the distinction, and I had a conversation just recently with teen court. Now, you take the same scenario with a misdemeanor possession of marijuana, you can't miraculously convert that into a trafficking amount because it's the weight. But when I looked at the number of participants who were white in teen court, teen court is a diversionary program for high school students and junior high school students, and it's, if they're charged with minor offenses, they can go participate in this program. I don't even know if possession of marijuana is included in it, but I did look at the statistics as far as participation, and you had almost 4 times the participation of white students in teen court as compared to blacks. So that again goes into my concept of the rule of law and what dictates whose participation. And that's just a reality. That's just the numbers. And so that's my best direct answer with my involvement in the criminal justice system.
Another question.
Love this panel. Okay, it's a question and an announcement. Okay, you're talking about conversation. So Multicultural Health is having a conversation on the educational achievement gap, innovative solutions, next Wednesday at Booker High School. My question is, how do we find the way, what legislatively, through this council on the study of men, et cetera, to shift the money away from the prison industrial complex to preventive strategies, to change our reading level so that, right now in Sarasota, 1/3 of the students in 3rd grade can't read at level, and by 10th grade, only 1/3 of the African American students are reading at grade level, and half of them are not graduating high school. So obviously we have to do some early intervention. We know that they look at the statistics. We know that where somebody lives by zip code will determine their fate. So that's my question. How do we get that money, the funding, to be able to make the change we need to happen?
I'm going to ask Dr. Renier to answer that question.
2 weeks ago, we had a statewide conference on that very issue, how to close the achievement gaps, on the historic campus of Bethune-Cookman University. And the dialogue there was to invite some of the best performing superintendents of school throughout the state to come to Bethune-Cookman and talk about how to educate some boys. And we had some impressive representation of superintendents across the state show up, and we discussed that very issue. And we are in the process of writing a position paper to present to the governor next month and the legislator to ask for money and how money should be directed to change, to really make a difference in the achievement gap. The superintendents were incredibly transparent in their discussions. We learned that this talk about how well the education system is doing in Florida is a lie. There's no data that supports it. In fact, the best data says there's been no change in Florida's education system at all in the last 6-7 years. None. In fact, nobody's collecting data. Not OPAGA, no SHOT report, not the Commissioner of Education's own office. So the talk on TV and among some elected officials how well we're doing is just made up. It's simply no data. And we're going to challenge them with that information, because this comes from the superintendent's own mouth during that conference. So hopefully we're going to knock loudly in Tallahassee, and hopefully people will listen.
Last question.
Yeah. I guess this question is primarily for Larry Eager. I happen to be a practicing attorney myself, and I apologize for putting you on the spot. But it seems to me that you have the most direct contact with the problems that arise, in as much as you represent many of the young people who get into trouble here. And the question I wanted to ask you is this: do you ever find that young people who come into your office who have been charged criminally come in with signs of having been roughed up, having been beaten? And if so, what do you do about it, and what kind of reaction do you get if you do bring it to the attention of the police?
When you say roughed up and beaten, are you referring to by law enforcement? Yes. Well, obviously, first of all, I'll disagree with one of the premises of your discussion, because I think law enforcement has the first contact, and and I don't want to second guess every officer. As a matter of fact, my experience, I've been an attorney with the Public Defender's Office now. Come November, it'll be 30 years. And so you do have instances, I believe, of police abuse, or should I say excessive force. And we certainly document it. But this keeps going back to my argument of the rule of law. And the frustration that I'm confronted with is not from the perspective of law enforcement, but unfortunately, it's with this guy here and his brethren. Because when I take forward a motion to suppress, and I have two officers whose testimony conflicts with one another, and the judge will sit there with the temporary suspension of disbelief and disregard the arguments that are presented and the facts that are presented, and still say, we're still going to deny your motion to suppress. That instills values in our clients and the community that shows that there's a different achievement of law. There's a different, what was the argument? I have to look back to my notes. As far as access to justice. And that's where my frustration is. It's so easy to second guess what happened on the street. We had the discussion, and I was anticipating the conversation of body cameras and what that opens up, and the good and the bad in that. It's a good thing, I think, but I also, the idea that we've become into this security surveillance society, that we have cameras throughout certain communities but not others, so that we can keep tabs on things. Everything's a double-edged sword. But as far as specific instances, we do due diligence, we investigate, and we raise the complaints. But like the education question, we find more and more people just don't care.
Judge, do you want to respond to that? It looks like you've had.
Excluding this gentleman to my left.
Well, first of all, I think I'm sure that Public Defender Eager did not mean to disparage the judiciary the way he did, but one of the primary roles that I was taught, and I think all judges are taught, is that one of the primary roles of the judiciary is to protect its citizens from its government, and I think we do that. I think the vast majority, and I'm saying the vast majority of the judges, not only locally but nationally, understand that they are the third branch and that they are the last real backstop before some people are actually swept away for the rest of their life. So I'm very proud of what we do. The one thing that you have to understand is that I'm a real believer in our system of justice. I know that it has its flaws, and I know that there are instances of injustice. But when you look at the vast majority of cases that appear in front of not only judges but juries, the vast majority of decisions I don't think anybody could argue with. There are going to be decisions that are going to be controversial, There are going to be verdicts that are going to be controversial. But at the same time, you know, I have enough faith in our system and in the government in terms of the safeguards that if someone is abused by law enforcement, if someone is beat up by law enforcement, there are checks and balances that will hopefully come out on the end of justice on that. So you're going to have examples of it, but for the most part, I think that we do a pretty good job. I did want to talk to Captain Robinson about the camera issue. I just wanted to leave him with that question. Is it a response to what happened in Ferguson, or was the issue of the camera something that was going to happen regardless?
I'm actually happy to say that we were working on that prior to that incident. I can tell you that it definitely brought that conversation to the forefront. And I think as we progress through this, I don't want to say experiment, but the evolution of this idea, we don't want to turn it into a surveillance state, but there are so many differing ideologies on these cameras, from, as Larry said, there should be a camera everywhere, in every car, on every police officer. And then you can have the conversation with another group that says, I should never be subject to surveillance of any type. And there are federal wiretapping laws, there are state regulations, there are internal procedures that need to be vetted. Right now, we're moving forward with a pilot program, and one of the things that we did take into consideration with the development of that pilot program was an equal distribution of those cameras within the different districts within the city of Sarasota, so that no one would say, well, we're putting every camera in Newtown. You know why? Because that should happen. We have 2 cameras per shift per district. I just want to make sure my math is correct. I was a history major, not a math major in college. We have 2 on the south side, we have 2 on our central district, we have 2 on our north district, and that'll be 24 hours a day for our test period, which we believe will be roughly a year, 8 months to a year. And we're really hoping that we get an idea of where this conversation is going, primarily from the federal government. And from the state, Senate, and House. There's some legislation currently going on. But our point is, if you're going to be in this conversation, let's get in this conversation, because it might just be something that the federal government mandates across the board. And we want to be prepared and have our articulate answers for those questions as they arise. And hopefully it lends itself to a more transparent and recorded, so there isn't the question like the gentleman asked, well, what actually happened? And there are differing views on that whole thing from point of view and whatnot. But you know, the old adage is a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, a video might be worth 10 times that if it's used appropriately. And we're hoping through this plan or this program that we can vet out some of the issues and really make something positive to assist in our engagement with our community, not just African American, not white, not rich, not poor, but so that everyone has equal footing when they talk to a Sarasota police officer, which is what we strive to provide.
Trevor, I have a last question for you, and these are the cards that they hand out. And I think for many people, it's kind of shocking that this would have to be done, as we said, and we appreciate Captain Robinson saying you appreciated that people would know the law. My question is, how do you distribute these? How are they given out?
Many times we go out and we do community forums and we do presentations and give the pamphlets out then. It's in a lot of the churches around the community and the African American community. Or you can just call our office and get some of them if you want some for your youth group. Or just call us and we'll come and do the actual presentation for you.
That's great. I'd like to thank our panel today. I think each of these gentlemen who gave us a great pulse of our city are really on the front lines. And in your respective departments, you can see, I think we feel pretty secure that not only are things addressed, but even the problems and the self-reflection that you all have about the challenges within your own departments as well as what we have to face that kind of makes our city. So we appreciate you in your positions and bringing our city forward as we move forward and really make this city continually on the road to be better. I want to thank you for coming to our second panel. Our third one will be coming up in next month, and certainly give another round of applause for our panel. Thank you. We will have copies of this. If you would like to take a look down here, we're going to get them. So if you would like to see what they look like, they're here. Thank you again.